Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Micronation, Chapter 2. The Case of the Cockroach Robot. I considered leaving the nutjob, I really did, but he paid twice the usual money for a fourth of the hours. It also had all kinds of nice perks, like watching Darla. It was simply too sweet a deal to pass up, despite the robotic insanity. Thus far, the only thing worth writing about had been the disastrous trip up to Alaska that had only raised more questions than it answered. We found what might or might not have been a profound scientific discovery, only to have it whisked away by mysterious forces. After that happened, we'd spent the better part of 4 months waiting around doing nothing. Prow fumed and bugged Darla to find us a case. She kept setting the bar lower and lower until finally we were reduced to a solid month of walking around tailing cheating husbands and bail bond jumpers solely for something to do. Darla, it turned out, was remarkably good at chasing down would-be runaways. Still, she slept a lot of the time, and Prow had to use his nose always had his nose in a mystery novel. I had 24 hours a day to waste in the middle of a desert in Prow's bizarre house with nothing but time and thousands of mystery novels. Thus you can imagine my state of mind when I looked Darla up on one of our typical Saturdays. She wore emerald green colored contact lenses because Prow liked her eyes that way. I preferred blue. She was in a mechanic's jumpsuit. "You've obviously been working on something," I said. I had a habit of saying things that were obvious. "Yes, I've been expanding the greenhouse. I have a few ideas about doing a small biosphere, and Prow is willing to fund them. Then again, he's willing to fund just about anything if you approach him the right way about it." "Is that so?" I said, feigning curiosity. Darla was quite attractive, but that didn't mean I was into all her kink-no-techno hobbies. "So how's work? Any new cases?" "Certainly strange you should mention that. I've got one, but I haven't mentioned it to Prow," she said. "What? Why not? He'd probably take a lost dog at this point." I looked at a puddle of oil shaped like President McKinley's head on the floor. She tugged her earrings nervously. "Well, it involves an old acquaintance of mine. Prow has a rule that we can't have any cases that involves relatives or friends." "Huh?" "I don't understand it myself. Something about maintaining the purity of the work," she shrugged. "Right. He's an idiot. What's your friend's name?" She perked up, a little hopeful now. "Professor Ylentab. He was one of my chemistry teachers in college. We get along great, and we still keep in touch. When he found out what I was doing, he mentioned that he had an unusual situation that he could use my opinion on." I nodded. "Well, that sounds more than an email to me, or that sounds more like an email to me rather than a case, but that's beside the point. You know the good professor's name. One could almost say that we're long-lost friends in a matter of speaking. I suspected this was one of Prow's stupid rules. He had a lot of stupid rules." "I don't understand." Darla crinkled her nose in that particularly cute way. "It's simple. Professor Ylentab is now my old acquaintance, and you will introduce him to Prow as such." I put my fists on my hip with my elbows wide. "But his rule," I snickered. "Ah, but remember, I'm special. I'm the Watson, and therefore the rules, whatever the heck they are different with me. Look, just tell him. It'll work. You'll see." She gave me a doubtful look, but shrugged and waved me inside. We wandered past the stacks of books and headed towards Prow's den at the center of his little self-built maze. I tried not to look up at the glaring fluorescent lamps that lit the cavernous interior, but couldn't help it. It was like the inside of a Titanic warehouse. Prow had bought the whole complex on the cheap, since it had once been a movie set for a disastrous failed movie no one had ever heard of. Prow sat in his chair reading The 7% Solution for what I would guess probably the 1,000th time, and looked up at me smiling. "Watson, so good of you to come. Please sit down." I come bearing a case. There was a curious and highly disturbing look in Prow's eye that I had at that moment that I had not hitherto now seen. "Oh? Do tell." "Well, see, there's this old friend of mine, a professor back at my old alma mater," I said. I felt a tiny bead of sweat on the back of my neck as the nutjob looked at me with those weird, ghoulish eyes of his. "He's got a problem with the robot. However, since it's a lot of techno mumbo jumbo is beyond me, I asked Darla to look it up and have him explain the details to her. It was the lamest attempt at diversion in the world. Fortunately, with Prow, it didn't really take that much, and as he watched Darla, he didn't seem to have the slightest amount of suspicion. Totally guileless. That didn't make him an innocent. "Well," Darla said, coughing to bite back the laughter she was holding back. The professor was working with a robot. It's been acting very strange. The software guys can't figure it out, and it seems to be accepting stimuli from outside of its parameters each time they run the experiment. What would that experiment be? Prow asked. They're attempting to make a combat-capable humanoid robot, basically a robot soldier. Darla looked at me. Not economically feasible, I said. Even if they could make it, each one would cost hundreds of thousands. Actually, Darla said, you'd be amazed at how expensive training and equipment a human soldier can be. And the fact is, this program never even thought about replacing human troops. It's more about supplementing the ability of existing ones to go into dangerous places. I must admit, Prow said, I'm not entirely enthusiastic about helping with a war project. Don't get me wrong. I love explosions as much as the next man, but quite often these things have a habit of having all kinds of shadowy strings attached, Darley replied. That's where the research money is. Each good scientist knows you get money from that and divert it into a more peaceful and useful projects that you label as tangential or incidental research. I was about to agree when I remembered the luck we'd had with our last employer. Giving up any pretense of knowing my former buddy, the professor, I asked, so what does chemistry have to do with a robot that isn't behaving the way it should? How did he become involved with it? Smell, Darla touched her nose. Beg pardon, I said curtly. Her looks were not enough to belie my extreme distaste for nonsensical, non-committal answers. Sight is a lot harder for a machine to do than you might think. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been poured into trying to refine visual recognition programs. So? She pulled out a magazine and pointed to a recent article. So as good as they've gotten, they're still really primitive, at least as far as making them autonomous. The idea is to take a sense of smell and add it to the visual sensor to add it to its sophistication. Smell is in some ways a lot simpler problem for the machine to break down. Case in point, to program an infinite shapes of the human body can take a lot of questions for a processor to ask. Software is pretty good at identifying those at this point, but it can be slow. Smell is much simpler. Is there a human being nearby? Yes or no. Is there gunpowder nearby? Yes or no. I thought about it. All right, I guess the speed would be a pretty important factor for a combat robot. Darla nodded. I shrugged. Anything would be more interesting than hanging around this place regardless. So do we take the case or not? Prow said without hesitation or surprise. We will definitely take the case. What about your policy of never taking a case from a friend? Darla asked. I've decided I was wrong. Darla sighed. I could tell from the look on her face it felt like it's because I'm a female thing is an issue, isn't it? Issue. She didn't press her case. Prowl lived in his own little world, and arguing with him was about as useful as sending a friendly text message to a brick wall. Walls have an excuse. They don't own cell phones. Prowl had 17 cell phones. He had to, quote, keep in touch, he said. He had never used one in my sight during our 6 months association. Darla, please make all the arrangements, Prowl said enthusiastically. Of course, Quiessence. We're off to help the professor. The game is afoot. Scene. Darla flew us to Springfield, Missouri. I would not have considered Springfield to be the cusp of major technological resource, but I was wrong. The professor's office was in the chemistry building. It was a rat hole. Thank heavens you've come, he smiled and looked at us each quite gratefully. We've had another incident. His large, white, bushy eyebrows went up to his forehead for a moment, then slid back down. He wore a white lab coat and had a distinguished professorly sort of air about him. It was somewhat comforting to know that television stereotypes can be vindicated in real life. This guy was a capital professor of the mad but kindly variety. Darla hugged him and said, We'll do everything we can to help. Can you give us more details about what's going on? I can do more than that. Show me. I can show you. Please come this way. One of the classrooms has excellent video equipment for teleconferencing, and I think it's the most appropriate place. We followed him into a large white-tiled room with desks arranged in tiers that gazed down upon the lecture podium. A large white screen in the south side of the room rose up. The podium lowered into the floor through a separate trapdoor. We all sat down in chairs and watched the screen as the professor started the footage he wanted us to see. The robot was pretty funny looking. It was a lot bulkier than those crowd-pleasing humanoid robots shown in the car companies, but it was definitely humanoid. Its legs were actually surprisingly squat, and it seemed to flare out when it walked, while its arms were longer and spindlier. This is Aorta. I've been working on the basics of the design for about 5 years, but it kept running into problems with the autonomous portion of the robot. It isn't functionally autonomous. Indeed, a good chunk of its more advanced programming is embedded in the mainframe. However, because the robot will often be in situations where continuous radio broadcast will be impossible, it has to be able to operate for at least a few hours with no link to the mainframe at all. This is why they ordered my help. Order is not really designed for fighting. It was configured as though it is configured with a heavy caliber pistol. Its primary purpose is to act as a scout or a decoy in a hostile situation. Yes, Prowse said with annoyance. We all know about that. What we want to know is the mystery. Tell us why it's acting strangely. The professor seemed somewhat nonplussed by Prowl, but nodded politely and skipped past several technical diagrams. Given the speed at which the professor was moving, I actually became grateful for Prowl's bluntness. The screen showed a wider area that looked almost like the grounds of a rodeo. It had a heavy dirt floor with a few poorly constructed fake buildings and large metal cages. It was obviously some kind of converted stadium. Aorta began slowly moving through the broken bits of metal and wood in its way, going from one end of the field to another. The pistol looked strange in its elongated, delicate fingers, but I watched it shoot the pistol at the designated targets. It hit a fair percentage at a time. It wasn't too good with targets that moved out of the way, though. Every motion it took emitted no sound whatsoever. This is the way Aorta was performing 5 weeks ago. It had room for improvement, but progress was steady but impressive. Now, if you look carefully, you can see what's been happening. The screen changed and Aorta was slowly moving around the wall. At first, it looked like someone had programmed it to imitate a mime doing an impression of running into an invisible wall 3 feet from an actual one. Then it started moving around in circles as if it were trying to find something. Then it scurried over to the exit and waited. It waited there for about 20 minutes before shutting down. Now first, the professor sighed, let me cut you off the obvious. It can't be a virus. We know because we built the entire internal CPU 5 times from scratch with spare components, and it's always done the same thing. We can't replace the mainframe, but we scoured every inch of code and used backups from 6 weeks ago. We've run the system without any outside contact, and things went fine until a week went by, and then it started acting up again. It did the exact same thing every time. Could someone have delivered a virus through some other method, a wireless network or something, I asked? We don't think so. Since this is a military project, we've had access to some pretty sophisticated electronic monitoring equipment, most of which I'm afraid are classified, but I can tell you that the only signals coming in and out of Aorta are the ones that come from the mainframe. Have you considered artificial intelligence? Prow asked. I rolled my eyes. Darla would have too, except she was asleep. She did that a lot. I don't blame her. This was pretty boring. The professor smirked. Artificial intelligence. Yes. It uses self-teaching techniques, but don't expect it to go all HAL on us if that's what you mean. How do you know? Because it's, quite frankly, if it had a problem of that magnitude, I'd be a very rich and very lucky man. All kidding aside, the code is behaving in an irrational fashion. That hardly means it's coming to life. Though you do bring up a good point. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Well, Darla. By now, they're quite confident it isn't a software problem, which means that the things it are doing are a direct result of the stimulus we placed for it to adapt to. Is it artificially intelligent? Yes, it is. Now we need to figure out what's making it malfunction. Maybe it's trying to communicate with you, Power asked. The professor gave Prow a rather odd look and then looked at Darla, who was still asleep. A rather awkward silence filled the room for almost 2 minutes. I could tell the doctor really didn't want to dignify Prow with a response and had written him off entirely. Darla was the one he'd asked for, yet he seemed strangely reluctant to wake her. Fortunately, I had no such compulsion and poked her in the ribs. Who, what, where? She blurted as she slowly and lightly sat up. Are you ready to look at it? The professor said hopefully. Oh, she blushed. Yes, I am. Didn't apologize for it. Darla didn't apologize for a lot of things. I liked that about her. She was who she was. You either accepted it or you didn't. That, and when she said she was sorry, you knew she meant it. The actual site was off campus. It was about a 45-minute drive to a semi-rural compound about 12 miles away from the highway. We passed the entire time in an eerie, unsettling silence. Darla slept. Prow was making all kinds of crazy notes on his notepad, probably something involving tinfoil. I enjoyed staring at Darla while she slept. She's quite pretty. She woke up at one point and smiled, but rather looked disturbed at the same time. I couldn't have upset her too much because she went right back to sleep after that. At least, I think she was. She might have had one eye open. The building itself was pretty innocuous. Just some kind of large warehouse, but apparently it had a much larger complex underground. The professor didn't bother to explain to us what it had originally been used for, but for some inexplicable reason, I found myself wishing I were wearing something in fashionable lead. Iota looked at us much more menacing in person than it had in the film. The robot was actually quite tall, but some of the erector set components that made its arms and legs were visibly sharp. That primal animal part of the back of your mind that knows when something is dangerous kept screaming at me to get away from the thing. Of course, since me and mine have never actually been the torch-wielding, pitchfork-calling set, I just let it be. Suck it up, soldier. The professor walked to a large spot on the dirt floor and said, "Here, this is where it's been walking in circles. That exit over there is where it heads towards, but never actually leaves. We think we have set up every kind of scanning equipment we could think of. You're welcome to use it. I'll be in the lobby grading some papers if you need anything." He seemed to trust Darla, but I couldn't help but smile at his nervous glances he gave Prow. I ignored the ones he kept giving me as he left. I looked from Prow to Darla and then back again. "So what now?" I asked. Darla, being the incredible practical sort, moved up to Aorta and began examining it. She didn't touch any of the special equipment that the professor had left. Prow continued looking at his notes. I just stood there. I mean, what else was I supposed to? I'm just an observer anyway. No one said anything. That was fun. I yawned and joined Darla in examining the robot. It had a very intricate circuitry, but I couldn't see anything unusual about it. The truth of the matter was that I couldn't recognize anything I saw in it anyway. I did, however, quite clearly recognize the on button. Since no one else really seemed to have anything to do, I pushed it. The horrified shrieks of, "What are you doing?" and "Are you out of your mind?" told me that apparently they had been doing something after all. Aorta made a sound like a high-pitched lawnmower as the internal mechanisms flared to life. Its eyes looked at us, but eerily did not change. Instead, aside from the noise and its animation, I couldn't tell the difference between the two states. It walked towards Prow and touched him with one of its arms. Prow said, "Don't do that," indignantly, and took a step back. It was at this point I noticed that Iota still had a pistol in its other hand. Great. Fortunately, Darla was thinking clearer than I was, and definitely ran up to press the off switch. This was an excellent idea in execution, except for the minor detail that it failed to deactivate the robot. Luckily, it did not try and shoot any of us, but it began its unusual miming dance 3 feet in front of Prow. As Prow took a step back, it took a step forward in almost a dance-like fashion. Its incredibly sharp arms came just inches from his face, and then he took a step backwards. Prow continued to step back until Darla shouted, "Stop!" Prow did so. The machine continued its unusual ritual, slowly taking a step around Prow and then forming a circle around him. Prow stood stock still, but its robot's arms got no closer than they had before. I could see Darla grab a piece of metal from the bucket of stuff that the professor had left and slowly advance on the robot. She gauged things for a moment, then tossed a piece of metal that landed between its flailing arms, entangling them. The robot stopped flailing its arms about, but moved to the right, away from both of them. Darla jumped for joy, but then missed her footing and collapsed in a heap. Graceful as a gazelle, but she had 2 left feet. Odd. Aorta hadn't quite stopped, however. It might be only a prototype, but it was a prototype combat robot, and apparently whatever Darla had done had activated its defensive mechanisms because it turned around when its tangled arms and aimed the pistol straight at Darla. I grabbed the tray that had all the equipment and held it up as an impromptu shield. In retrospect, it was an incredibly dumb thing to do, but I wasn't always the brightest bulb in the box. The pistol flared and a bullet bounced off a nearby concrete pillar, spraying dust on Darla and I. Prow ran up and tackled the thing, grabbed its arm. I still don't know how I managed to grab it without getting hurt. There was a loud crackling sound followed by utter silence. Darla managed to sit up and gave a cry in despair and ironic amusement. I turned and looked up and saw Prow slowly get up. While the robot might have been tougher than the average plastic toy you'd buy at a toy store, it was not designed to support the full weight of a large man like Prow. Its left and right arms were snapped in 3 places, and its right leg was twisted behind its head in an impossible angle as it lay on the floor. The lawnmower noise that now sounded like someone was trying to drown a robotic kitten. It hadn't shut down entirely, but it only had 1 leg remaining, and it was making it flail about in circles. The worst of it was that Prow actually seemed quite proud of himself. "Well, that's taken care of then." Pardon me, Sherlock. I use the term extremely reluctantly, for I fear that Prow would think I was giving him an honorific instead of calling him stupid. But the fact that you kept it from killing us also ignores the point that now we can't really figure out what it's been trying to do. Oh, elementary, my dear Watson, never fear, for I have the solution to what it has been trying to do. Oh, I said, mildly amused. I believe that the robot is in fact intelligent, and that it was trying to communicate with us. And your train of reasoning on this would be elementary. The creature was imitating the mating dance of several African beetles. I've studied quite thoroughly upon them, you know, indeed. Well, I'm not reading mysteries. I make it a policy to read anything and everything. You'd be amazed at the power knowledge can give you. You should consider asking for sponsorship from the Literary Council of America, I said sarcastically. Really, I've been thinking about the same thing myself. Please continue, Darla said, smiling. What? Oh, yes. Well, the fact of the matter is that the dance clearly matches the mating dance of several beetles. The computer had access to those files. Therefore, I believe it was trying to prove to us that it was intelligence. Why not just speak English? Its code is written in English, I asked. Ah, but you probably don't... You see, it probably didn't comprehend English. It probably didn't comprehend any language at all. Can you read your own DNA? And even if it could, and you can't read your file, I've read your file, you could you tell what your kind of DNA, the DNA codes was for your hair color? No, the robot spoke to us in a language it understood. It found an insect that resembled itself and was trying to communicate with us. Darla thought about this and then patiently asked, What was it trying to communicate? Prow pondered this. You don't have a clue, do you? Of course I do. It was life and the greater meaning of it all. So we have an insane theory about it with very little evidence in a broken robot. That's great. Who wants to tell the professor his beetle is dead? I said in a tone indicating that it clearly wasn't my job. Watson, you're brilliant. Oh, I sighed. Am I? Yes. It wasn't a beetle at all. It was a cockroach, metaphorically speaking. Well, metaphorically speaking, it could have been a beetle, but a cockroach comes more to mind. Ew, Darla said, making a face. Could we avoid the cockroach metaphor unless absolutely necessary? I'm afraid it is. You see, cockroaches are nature's ultimate survival machines. They seek out their own kind. It was trying to acknowledge something outside itself. Actually, Darla said, thinking about it, it is remote, but it might be theoretically possible. I mean, if something did become self-aware, seeking signs of external intelligence is a logical step. We told the professor. Needless to say, at first he didn't believe us. However, since apparently we'd taken the case for free, and Darla and I presented a more detailed case analysis of the whole thing, he passed it up the chain of command to his bosses. While writing the case analysis, I was actually surprised that it was at least remotely possible. The AI routines they were using were in fact deliberately patterned as much after life as possible, including some kind of virtual reality programming I barely understood. What I did understand was that after about 3 days, a bunch of military people showed up, packed everything into boxes, and made us swear that we would never, ever talk to anyone about anything regarding aorta again. It had been a kind of terrible embarrassment or terrible success, and given the nervous glances by the officers in charge, I tended to think it was more of the latter.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!
Welcome to the secret commentary / writing lessons that I'm putting at the end of these. So I think a little bit of background is in order. So I wrote the second novel after I wrote the first, obviously, and I wanted it to be a prequel. There's really only one character between the two of them that's shared, so it's set about 60 years before this dystopian, hard sci-fi. The first novel is a weird animal unto itself, but I had huge ideas on this one, on the second novel, Micronation. I've never liked the title, to be honest. with Grenade Man versus the Zombies and every novel that I wrote individually after that, I did a pretty good job. Have Name Will Travel is a good, distinctive, interesting name. The sixth novel, which I still don't know what I'm going to do with, I wrote for National Novel Writing Month, and that's another story into itself. But both Have Name Will Travel and Grenade Man vs. the Zombies, the title is right. It makes sense. Eye of the Mindstorm, it's okay. Micronation, just no title I ever came up with for this series ever worked quite right. And I think that's a reflection of how kludgy it is. And honestly, this chapter is the biggest reason why this novel does not attract interest and why I ultimately gave up on fixing it. And I do have ideas about someday going back and rewriting the second, first, and fourth novel, the one I co-wrote with Ken Leitner, in an inspired by series, but basically rewriting them from scratch. They all have potential. They could all fit in the same setting, but there's enough story problems that if I was going to do it right, I would literally want to start it from scratch. And I may still do that, but given that I'm working on Army of Fire right now, and I've also got to write a sequel or multiple sequels to Forever West, and then I've got this passion project that the sixth novel will ultimately become a part of, called Lasers Against the Dark Lord. That rewriting the three worst of the 7 novels I've written so far in a trilogy is a distant fourth project, if ever. And plus the small projects I'm doing right now, like Project NIMBY and some poetry stuff. And the reason this chapter doesn't work is because it grosses people out, right? Cockroaches, first of all, are disgusting. There are some very interesting ideas that I wanted to explore in what was originally this short story and became the second chapter. It does make sense that an AI trying to mimic life poorly would pick up the basics of life, of eating or drinking or the like. But, I could have had the AI trying to eat instead of trying to mate with Quiessence. It's just basically gross, and while it is weird, and there is an audience for weird, it's not weird enough to be as weird as I could be. It's not gross enough that if you're going for that, it should be gross. It's just kind of off-putting and disconcerting. And so, as a result, it's basically right off the bat, I set up an interesting idea. Well, what if someone wanted to be a Sherlock Holmes and paid an assistant to document it? Interesting premise. And then immediately goes off the rails of, oh, that's where you're going with this? Well, okay, bye. In fact, frankly, when I eventually put together an audio version book of this, and eventually have in the archives of the podcast and my YouTube channel all 7 novels, I strongly suspect that as the years go by, this one will attract the least interest. Could be wrong about that. Don't think I am. You'll notice that there is, as I said in the notes from the last chapter, absolutely no hints or indication as to who the dancers are. There are hints of the larger conspiracy that you will slowly learn about. But the point is that there's a lot of loose ends. And the idea of having a loose anthology is a great one. I might still repeat that element when I rewrite this series, theoretically, eventually. Do you have a great title for it, by the way? It would be called The Boy with the Dragon Taboo, parroting and also writing up of the girl who played with fire books, set in Finland. Like I said, I have some ideas, but ideas, as you can see from this story, do not by themselves make sufficiently interesting material. If I was, in terms of teaching, I think the other useful thing about this chapter is you'll notice that in the last 3 or 4 minutes, if I'm going to go there about a cockroach mating, right, let's fully explore that, right? Like, does the robot actually have a digital life? Does it try and escape its robotic shell? Is it only capable of functioning in its robotic shell? It's actually potentially an interesting concept. And if you're going to go there, right, go all the way. But instead, it's, I pull a full Indiana Jones because I wasn't sure where I wanted to go with it. Plus, too many people and too many idea things back then were icky, and people were icky. And I was pulling a full-on Lucas who, is technically brilliant, but you'll notice that he's not comfortable with his actors. It took me a while to get comfortable with humanity. And frankly, I'll be honest, if you're a writer and you're not comfortable, at least with the idea of humanity, even if you're purely an introvert and don't like being around real people, which I'm actually totally fine with and always have been, you might want to reconsider your profession, because art, and in particular writing, whether it's poetry or even nonfiction, is about exploring the human condition. And I was Mormon when I wrote this, and you can see it in the restrictions of my self-restrictions, and, the lack of swearing, the lack of just color that these characters could have. They're interesting, but they could be a lot more interesting.